Welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Stuart.
And I'm Simon.
We're both property people running our own businesses. This podcast is simply us chatting, as we often do, about anything and everything property. So, Simon, we were thinking about subjects for this conversation, and we were thinking about property terms.
Indeed. And I thought we should just have a chat through a nice long list of acronyms and try and explain them.
Lovely.
But you suggested perhaps we should start with what you can do with a property, and I think that's a great approach. So there you go. There's a property on the market. What are you going to do with it, Stuart?
Well, I think we were certainly from my side, I was thinking about what are the options for property if we're thinking about the highest level. Before understanding lots about property, I guess the thought was you just buy a property. That's the only option. We just buy a property and we live in a property. That's your first thought, isn't it?
Yep, that's the simple one.
And I was speaking with someone recently who said that he's done a lot in property in the last few years, and he said, I feel really naive that I thought I could only buy one property at a time, i.e. I had to buy a property, and then if I was going to buy another one, I'd have to sell that and buy, which I think it was a really sort of humble thing for him to say, but is a reminder that just because we know stuff doesn't mean everyone understands it. So, simple terms, what can we do? Well, we can buy a property. We can buy a property to sell.
Yep.
Or we like to call that flipping if we're going to do it in the short term.
Yep.
We can also have an option over a property, which, without getting into the details on this conversation, is essentially getting rights to that property without buying the property.
Yep. So there are lots of complicated structures for that can be used. But there's quite a common one, which is rent to rent.
Yep.
Often abbreviated as R2R. And that one probably is worth a bit of a mention because that does come up quite often. And this is actually something you've started looking at, isn't it, Stuart? So perhaps you should give us a little intro to rent to rent.
Well, I have started looking at it, exploring it at the very least anyway. I think a good story is I went to see a property yesterday in the local area. And rent to rent is the modern name, I guess, for subletting. And the reason I say that is because I went to see a gentleman yesterday and essentially his house has been trashed. It's one of those, fortunately, fairly rare stories you hear. Had some tenants in, stopped paying the bills almost a year ago, couldn't get into the property. Long story short, turns out the tenant, so he thought it was just a tenant in his family residence, was subletting the property room by room to other people. Turns out those other people, well, actually we don't know. It could just be that he was taking the money himself and whatever. But anyway, bringing back to the point of rent to rent, it is essentially you can rent a property from someone provided they are the legal owner of that property, and I make pains to say that because that's something I always ask. And if I were to progress with something, I'd make sure that I could see documentation that said they were the legal owner. Again, I'm probably going into more detail than is necessary on this conversation, but you essentially rent a property. You could rent a residential property, and then you could rent it by the room. So you don't own the property. You're not providing a deposit for that property, depending on what your agreement is.
Yeah, sort of continuing the what you do with the property. I think there's a couple of popular scenarios for rent to rent. And you say one is you rent the whole house, the whole property, and then you split it up and rent it as individual rooms, so an HMO, a house of multiple occupation. But the other one is you rent a property as a whole for a fixed monthly rent to that original landlord, but then you re-let it as a service accommodation or SA offering.
You're just trying to tick off as many of the acronyms as you possibly can and beat me to it, which you've done, and I'm really annoyed that you've got the bingo line already. You've done R2R, SA and HMO in a line.
Yeah, but I think that's less than halfway through our list, so it's okay. You've got time to catch up. I've lost where we were now. If we're not going to rent a house, we are actually going to buy a house. So what can we do with it once we've bought a house? You mentioned one option already, which is to sell it on again, to flip it. So typically that would be you buy a property, improve it in some way, and then put it back on the market to sell again. Although sometimes, I'm going to take another one off the list. You might get a property below market value, or BMV. Sometimes perhaps if you find an off market, property or something like that, or a very motivated seller. And you can potentially buy a property, do nothing to it, and put it back on the market, and potentially make a profit. I think such deals are very, very rare, but it's possible.
I would agree they are rare. So it's either you're buying, well, without getting into this debate, but below market value. If I were to be pedantic, if you're buying at a price that could be determined as the market value.
Oh, I'm glad you brought this up. Yep.
If we wanted to go down that road, as someone that is a pedant, I sometimes question that. However, I do understand it, because if we're on, I still call them B&V, by the way, so I would agree. But in our heads, if a property is worth 200k and we think we can get it for 180k, now, true B&V may well be that the property is worth 200k, but that vendor, the owner of the property, is in a need. You've stated motivated sellers, and given we're sort of doing a glossary, I think just to be clear, motivated seller is someone that needs to sell a property quick for a given reason, whether that's probate, divorce, emigration.
Just needs the cash.
The cash quickly. And I've been in that situation myself, and actually you're grateful. So there is true B&V in my mind is probably something more around that.
Yes, I agree completely. Yeah. So when you're talking about buying to then refurb or improve in some way before you then sell on, I think that's much harder to justify the BMV label, because it's a reduced price for a reason, because it needs the improvement. I think motivated seller is really the only, or the main likely scenario of finding an actual BMV property.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it as well. I've had a number of property deals pushed under my nose or in my email inbox where someone's talking about the great value in the property, but what I've actually seen is them forcing the value. So, with a property, if a property sourcer came to me and says, here's a property, it's great, we've got it for 190, and all you need to do, and this is an actual example, all you need to do is just build a 2-story extension, go into the loft, and it'll be worth 250. I'm like, okay, so I need to spend about 50,000. You're saying
and have lots of experience to be able to do that,
and be able to have the confidence to do that, which we could with the right teams. And then I look on Rightmove and it's up for 200, and then I think, well, I'm pretty confident that I can phone an estate agent, view a property, and get 5 to 10% knocked off the asking, because guess what?
Yeah.
Estate agents put 5 to 10% on what they might think the property's worth. Mm-hmm. Who knew? So for me, sometimes things get presented as good deals, and again, sources want money. So BMV, the point we're making there is below market value is a genuine. What is the actual marketable value of that the real purchase price? And a property that's on the market for 150 that's worth 200, if it's in a really poor condition, if you've looked at comparables, 150 is the market value. It's not 200.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
And that's the bit that frustrates me sometimes. And again, it's just a case of education. As people will put something, say, I've got a B&V property that's 20% below asking price. And you go, yes, but then I have to spend that gap to get it to that market value. That's not B&V.
Yeah, exactly.
That's market value.
Yep. Indeed. So it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but is, I think, often a bit misleading.
Yeah.
So let's try and move on to some terms that are less misleading. So if we're not going to buy a property to flip it on and resell it, what else might we do with the property once we bought it?
Well, buy and hold. So we're going to a standard buy-to-let, BTL. Have we mentioned that one?
No, I don't think we've mentioned the acronym.
Got one. Like 5-1.
Do you want to go for the next one as well? The most common form of buy-to-let.
Single let.
Yep, that's the simple approach, isn't it? So you buy a whole house and you rent out a whole house, or buy a whole flat and rent out a whole flat.
Yeah.
That's referred to as a single let.
Yeah, and often referred to as well as vanilla. buy-to-lets, just very straightforward, single lets. Something I envy those that do.
You do that yourself. Don't go complaining. But the majority of what you do is another one, which we haven't mentioned briefly, but do you want to mention again?
HMO.
Indeed, yeah.
So house of multiple occupation, depending on the council, it could be, well, the rules have changed slightly, but generally, 5 or more people from different households living in the same property.
Yeah, I think the strict definition of HMO is 3 or more.
3 or more.
But then 5 or more is licensable.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, the license. Yeah,
so there's
good shout.
And you're right. That some councils have tweaks around these definitions just to help keep us confused.
Yeah, because Crawley's licensing is 5 and above, isn't it? Which is still quite high.
5 people and above.
Yeah.
Well, that's the national licensing.
I'm sure in Plymouth it's 3.
Yeah, well, in Plymouth it's extra complicated because you've got planning permission concerns as well there.
Article 4. That's another story, isn't it?
Yep, indeed. That one's not even on our list. Not for today, anyway.
Definitely not.
So we've bought a property. We've decided we're going to hold on to it and rent it out in some way, shape or form. So we've got single let, where we let the whole thing. We've got HMO, where we split it up by the room. Another approach, which we've always mentioned very briefly, is serviced accommodation.
Holiday lets.
Yep. Do you want to give us a definition of those, Stuart? So
very simple, very short-term lets. So rather than renting a property for, let's say, 6 months or above, you're renting by the night. Typically when you look at properties on Airbnb or Booking.com or any other sort of platform like that, that's what we're thinking about when we talk about serviced accommodation, where people can come and stay in that property for 1 night, 2 nights. I think maximum number's 30 nights or something. There's nothing greater than that. And why do people do that? Because you could take a small property like a flat that maybe gets, let's say, £1,000 a month with it if you have to have it as a standard vanilla let that we've just talked about, single let. But by the night, if you're renting that for, say, £50 a night, that might go up to £1,500 a month. Let's not go into the costs attached to doing that, but in simple terms, that's why people might look at that as well, depending on the property location.
Yeah, indeed. I think, again, depending on the location, that kind of letting can either appeal to holiday and or holiday makers, should I say, or to business people as well.
Corporate,
for corporate lets and people or businesses who are bringing in staff temporarily or short terms.
Yeah, very popular at the moment.
Yep. So I think they're the sort of core approaches, aren't they?
Yeah.
We've got some other terms that we thought we might try and define around these. So one that I see come up a number of times is buy, refurbish and refinance, or BRR. It could also sometimes be referred to as buy, refurbish and rent, but depending on sort of your approach. So this is a very common form of rental, or a very common form of the rental setup process, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I'd say it's a standard model. Yeah.
Yeah. So you buy a house that's a little bit cheaper because it needs improving. You do those improvements, and then you hold on to it and rent it out. And along that path, you may also be able to refinance it to get a little bit of your initial investment out of it again.
Yeah, as we've shared recently.
Yep.
Yeah, that's one of the aims, because we want to take our money out and reuse that money. That's the power of properties, the leverage. That's why it's such a good investment asset class for the leverage.
Yep, indeed, yeah. So there are different types of refurbishment. So you might often hear the term light refurb. So what would you class as a light refurb?
I like buff and fluff. That's one of my favourites.
Okay, please do carry on defining.
I'm still talking about property, just to be really clear. I'm talking property. So light refurb for me, and I'm sure it's a little subjective, but light refurb for me would simply mean, and when I talk about buff and fluff, it's really painting the walls, tidying up, really any areas, usually communal spaces. Sometimes carpets make such a big difference, and
Oh yeah, definitely.
in my world is lower cost. So typically, light painting, just tidying up, possibly a new kitchen, maybe just kitchen doors, maybe looking at bathrooms. I mean, then we start getting a little bit heavier, but the light refurb would just be, for me, that's just standard. If we're talking vanilla let, that's the magnolia wall approach, where we just go and give everything a lick of paint, tidy up, so it just feels fresh and is ready to go.
Yep, indeed, yeah. And I think once you start replacing bathrooms and kitchens, I think that's sort of right at the edge of what I class as a light refurb.
It's borderline, isn't it? Yeah. I was actually thinking about replacing the doors. So sometimes that's a cheap option. Yep. If the casings of the kitchen is good, we can just replace doors. That's quite nice. But yeah, I'd completely agree. I think if we start talking then about ripping out kitchens and particularly bathrooms, where we're talking about waste and so on, then we're probably moving into medium refurb, yeah.
Yeah, right. So then right at the other end of the refurb scale, there's a term called back to brick. So this is where you pretty much gut a property and start again from scratch. And this might involve moving walls as well, but not necessarily. It could just be really stripping everything out of the property and starting again. Have you got any experience of that level of refurb? This is not a level that I've tried yet.
I was just thinking. I mean, back to brick. Yeah, we looked at. We have stripped something out, so it was basically an empty carcass, and looked at an extension. Another story for another day. I must remember was the planning process that we went through. In the end, we just went for a refurb, which was just taking everything out. I'm just going to add on to this as well with what we're talking about. When you go back to brick, you can then think about something we haven't put on there is strategies around sort of commercial developments to residential.
Oh yeah, that's a whole new list of terms.
Yeah, but in terms of the back to brick, that's what people do. They'll take, say, an office and rip everything out, literally go back to brick, and then they'll convert that into a residential, whatever, house, apartments, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So the last term on our list is a bit of a misnomer, really. So it's no money down or no money left in.
Right. I would actually like to get your view on this first for the audience, because I know where I stand. I'd be a bit of a schizophrenic if I didn't. So yeah, share with us, Simon. What's no money down?
So what is it? Okay, so the principle is that you buy a property sufficiently below market value that you can then do up, improve, refurb, what have you, that you can then refinance it such that your new refinance gives you back all of the money that you put back in, or that you initially put into that property. I don't think these deals really exist, or at least not without significant effort to find them.
But in that scenario, who's putting the money in to buy that property?
What do you mean?
In the scenario you've just given. So
initially?
Yeah.
Anybody who wants to buy a property. But
that's their money, so that's not...
Yeah. I mean, of course, in the simplest term, yes, somebody is coming along to do such a deal like this. They bring along their own money. But, of course, there are lots of other options. You can get finance from investors or joint venture partners,
and that's what I think.
That's
what I think people are talking about. I think it's none of their own money down.
Ah, you think so? So you think you can have money in, but it's just as long as it's not yours.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Well, I think from what I've seen in the property education circles, I think
I could go with that. Yeah,
that's what I believe. And what's your view on that? Well, you would just start to share with us.
I don't know I have any more views on that. I think that approach, so the idea of using somebody else's money to run a property deal, I think is it's perfectly okay as long as all parties are going into it with their eyes fully open. And I think it's a very bad idea for someone who is new to property investment. Either whether you're the person putting in the money or the person who's sort of running the deal. If you're new to property investment, I think it's a bad idea. But once you've got experience and you can point to examples where you've had success, then as long as you've got your eyes open, I think that's fine.
I think it's a really good point, and obviously I wholeheartedly agree with that. Well, I say obviously, but I do, because I think when people talk about no money down, there is a misnomer that there isn't money down, except I think for the really experienced people that I'm aware of, people that have been in the industry for, I would say, 10, 15 years plus, there are options, quite literally, as well as hypothetically, in terms of lease options, purchase options, where you can create agreements where you get the option to purchase a property, but for the sake of a contract, you have to put £1 down. So let's just say that that's no money. So I don't disbelieve that there are opportunities out there, but for the new and uninitiated, I think they'd be very hard to get a hold of and make use of, because you wouldn't have the experience to create those opportunities. Where I think a lot of what I've seen in the past is, people propound the NMD. We're going for the acronyms. The no money down approach is fine. If you find a property, you find your £100,000 property, you go and get that money from an investor, either to purchase the whole thing or deposit, exactly as you say. My frustration is that there is money down. It's not a no money down strategy. There is money involved. It might not be your money, but what is the cost to you then if it's not your money? And I think it just really further exacerbates your point. So my experience, and I do have experience of this in terms of, I have used other people's money. I could argue that I've probably done a few no money down deals if I wanted to, but they weren't no money down deals because there is always a value equation to be had. If someone gives me money, spookily enough, they want something in return. And that's usually a bit more money than they've given me.
Yep.
So there might be no money down deals, but without going into it on this podcast, they might want equity, they might want interest, they might want all of the above.
Yep.
So hopefully a bit clearer. There are no money deals, and there are definitely strategies. I wouldn't argue against the fact that you could, if you were really knowledgeable, get a property arranged where there's a good deal. And you've talked about it. In the past, what they were called the instant mortgages or super quick mortgages, where
self-certified mortgages.
Self-certified and express mortgages, where you could literally go visit a property, agree a purchase price of 150 if you've done your job. Actually, the property's worth 200 grand. Then within 24 hours, you've got the revaluation. You're getting a mortgage on the greater value. That's no money down.
Yeah, that's the sort of rich dad, poor dad approach to property investment, isn't it?
Yeah. And 2008 happened. The crash happened. Yeah. And we spoke about this on the recent podcast. So I won't go anymore. So no money down.
Yeah. And we've reached the end of our terms. So should we finish this one up here then?
Yeah, unless you want me to get back up on the no money down soapbox.
No, I think we'll finish it here.
Cheers.
So show notes can be found at thebusinessofproperty.com.